Well, thank you for coming. On behalf of Iowa State University, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's presentation by Matthew Nisbet on climate shift, clear vision for the next decade of public debate. Dr. Nisbet's presentation will discuss findings from a comprehensive study of the resources, strategies, and activities of environmental groups, of climate change scientists, and compare them to the same or different approaches, I should say, by conservative groups and corporate associations. He will challenge us to think about our role as educators and scholars in this public debate. Now, speaking as a journalist and a science communicator, I believe that media understand that climate change is a fact, but they mean that in a simple rather than scientific way. We in media know that change is constant, it's continual. Our business tracks change in the social environment every minute of every day on a micro and personal level, not on a macro and scientific level. Earlier this month, for instance, Osama bin Laden was killed. The world changed. When Al-Qaeda attacked the United States on 9/11 in 2001, the world changed. Journalists document all manner of change. In 2010 in Iowa, a new legislature was elected. A devastating flood, perhaps because of climate change, submerged several streets and towns. Assaults, thefts, murders happened in dozens of neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods changed. Those facts have one thing in common that climate change does not. Outcomes are definitive and culminate in an event. An enemy combatant is killed in a Navy SEAL assault. Airliners are hijacked and rammed into buildings or terrain in New York, Washington, D.C., or Pennsylvania. A Republican governor is elected in Iowa, and the GOP holds a majority in the State House. Spring rains cause a flood that destroys thousands of buildings. A neighborhood watch is established. After the slaying of a citizen, a family establishes a nonprofit association to honor a slain loved one. Climate change occurs in a much more complex system with multiple variables requiring expert analysis and interpretive data. In other words, journalists cannot figure it all out themselves without relying on viewpoints, strategies, and activities, often of opposing groups. The media are never comfortable in this position. Most journalists lack scientific training. Worse, if political or philosophical agendas support two camps of scientists, as is the case in climate change, even if one camp outnumbers the other, or even if one camp has a vested interest in something or an outcome, then the issue becomes murkier from a journalism perspective. More often than not, reporters throw up their hands and file stories giving both sides equal treatment and coverage. But this is not how science is done. Even complex science. Facts must speak for themselves. They must present a logical narrative. That narrative should foreshadow an ending or outcome. Other scientists must verify those facts, test that logic, measure those outcomes, and if it all measures up to peer review, they should be accepted as truth and not degenerate into just another opinion in the blogosphere. We in education are citizens of peer review. Our careers advance, stall, or even end by those measures. That's why we must listen closely to what Dr. Nisbet will disclose. He is an author of more than 35 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters and serves on the editorial boards of Science Communication and the International Journal of Press and Politics. His scholarship has been cited more than 500 times in peer-reviewed literature and in more than 150 books. This year, he was named a Google Science Communication Fellow in recognition of his work on climate change. He holds degrees from Dartmouth College and Cornell University and is an associate professor at the School of Communication at American University in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Matthew Nisbet.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here tonight. It's an amazing turnout for a Friday evening, so thank you for coming. I'm very much looking forward to your questions and your comments at the end of my talk tonight. We're in a very interesting place politically right now, both on the issues of climate change and energy. With the failure of cap-and-trade legislation last year, major environmental groups, many science organizations, and politically active scientists are without a clear policy agenda. I refer to this longstanding coalition as the Green Network in a recent report that I released several weeks ago and that I'll be talking about tonight. The policy focus, for the most part, remains on regulatory approaches. There's a belief that major legislation similar to cap-and-trade is probably not possible until at least 2013. So in the short term, over the next couple years, Democrats and environmental organizations are focusing on clean energy and fuel efficiency standards, mostly defending the EPA's ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, and also focusing on state regulation of greenhouse gas emissions similar to those in California, and also opposing the construction of new power plants. Environmental groups and science organizations are also focusing heavily in reinvesting in science communication. There's efforts among some environmental leaders to argue for environmental groups that they need to broaden their networks and alliances in places like the Midwest in Iowa. There's other groups such as Bill McKibben's 350.org have intensified their campaigns against what they see as the major obstacles to action on climate change. Koch Industries, the Koch brothers as philanthropists, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And then other science organizations and groups are training scientists to be more effective in media relations, blogging, and there's even rapid response teams of climate scientists who have formed to serve as Q&A service, provide a Q&A service to journalists, and also rapid respond to misinformation out there in the media. While the longstanding Green Network of groups continue to focus on climate change as the major issue, an emerging group of what I call the Innovation Network of groups have shifted focus from climate change to focus on energy and security and the need to innovate in terms of energy technologies as the pathway forward. And this focus is captured in Obama's State of the Union address from earlier this year, a State of the Union address that he titled Winning the Future. It was very interesting in the State of the Union address because he used science and innovation as the overarching frame to talk about a whole host of domestic policy agenda issues and even some foreign policy issues. He talked about biomedical research, information technology, and especially investment in clean energy technology as the principal pathway forward in terms of job creation and the economy. He even talked about national security, infrastructure, and transportation, United States continued international leadership. Even education was defined in terms of science education and science teachers. Even when he talked about immigration, he didn't talk about general immigration reform, but rather connected immigration reform to science in terms of keeping talented graduate students here in the United States and allowing more graduate students to come here to study at universities. And in terms of policy agenda, the Innovation Network is focusing on increasing research spending at universities, improving overall science education, ending subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, and also tax breaks to oil companies, using defense spending, the Defense Department procurement system to catalyze energy technology innovation, and to promote a broad range of energy technologies, nuclear, natural gas, wind, solar, carbon capture, and biofuels. Well, as both of these networks move forward with their goals, and these networks have, in many cases, overlapping constituents and shared goals, they tend to define the role of the public fairly narrowly. Obama's in his State of the Union address, when he talked about science education and the need for science education, he talked about the outcome as being creating the workers for tomorrow. When environmental groups and science organizations even talk about the role of the public in controversies over climate and energy, they often talk about the public as spectators to an elite battle. The public is supposed to answer appropriately in public opinion polls when asked what to do about climate change or what they believe, and they're supposed to call up Congress and voice their opinion, but otherwise the public has very little role or is called upon rarely to actively play a role in terms of their input relative to what to do on climate change and energy. And tonight I'm going to argue that one of the things that we need to do as educators, as universities, as environmental organizations and science organizations, we need to shift from defining the public exclusively as workers or spectators to a political battle and start to invest in the public as citizens, as direct participants. And there's a number of reasons why we need to think about investing directly in facilitating direct public participation in decision-making about climate and energy. And one of those is that from a normative standpoint, these decisions are too important to leave to elected officials, experts, industry, and interest groups alone. Questions related to climate change and energy apply directly to questions of equity, fairness, and justice. And citizens, a wider scope of citizens, deserve to have a voice in the decisions. We also know from research that participation promotes innovation through idea creation, the formation of networks, increased trust among participants, greater feelings of efficacy that they have a say in decision making. And this is very important because experts and decision makers don't have all the answers. In understanding how to make communities more resilient to the impacts of climate change, or how to develop energy technologies at a regional level, they will need direct input from a diversity of stakeholders and the public in order to make scalable and tailored solutions to states such as Iowa and regions across the country. We also know from research that direct participation is one of the best ways for the public to learn, not just about the technical side of science, but other forms of learning in terms of ethics and political dimensions. It's also important in terms of skill acquisition among participants, training the next generation of leaders and elevating overall the scope of participation on science and environmental issues. And then finally, direct public participation is very important because it tends to increase accountability, transparency, and lead to institutional change, not only among government players, but also among the NGO sector, the many long-standing organizations that have worked on climate and energy over time. But as I'll talk about tonight, there are just really two central barriers to widening several central barriers to widening public participation. Some of those barriers are structural, as I'll talk about. Other barriers are political, and then other barriers are individual and motivational. How motivated is the public? How relevant do they see questions related to climate and energy? How many members of the public are willing to come out on a Friday evening to hear and to discuss and debate what to do about climate and energy as you are here tonight? And that's what I'm going to be focusing on. What are those barriers? And then what are some strategies for overcoming those barriers? That will be my focus for this evening. Well, one of the barriers that we tend to assume is on climate change is that the media, the mainstream media, continues to engage in widespread false balance on the fundamentals of climate science. Is climate change real, and is it human-caused? In the report that I released several weeks ago that you can find at climateshiftproject.org, I took a look at how the media covered the fundamentals of climate science in the years 2009 and 2010. And before I have you start looking at that graph, let me give you a little bit of background. One of the most heavily cited papers and studies on the appearance of false balance in climate change was done by Max Boykoff and his brother Jules Boykoff and appeared in 2004. And what they looked at in 5 national news organizations, 5 trend-setting national newspapers, is the degree that these newspapers up through 2002 reflected the consensus view on the reality and causes of climate change, a falsely balanced view, balancing the consensus view with a skeptical view, or a dismissive view, a skeptical view on the fundamentals of climate science. And what they found is coverage through 2002, more than 50% of articles were falsely balanced. This paper is famous now because it's cited in Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. Al Gore poses the difference between where the peer-reviewed literature is on climate change to the findings of the Boykoff and Boykoff paper. And this paper is often now ritually cited as evidence of false balance even today. What's interesting is that Max then followed up with that paper with a study that appeared in 2007 that looked at the same newspapers through 2006. And what he found was that by 2006, false balance on the fundamentals of climate science had virtually disappeared from news coverage. To the point by 2006, I believe it was 96% of coverage reflected the consensus view. Yet as a structural barrier to participation, we still tend to presume that the mainstream media engages in false balance. If you go to scientific meetings, if you read blogs, you'll hear the false balance claim made over and over again. So in my own research, I decided to replicate Max's methodology and look at where coverage was in 2009 and 2010. At 5 leading news organizations, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Politico, and CNN.com. And this is the findings grouped across 3-month periods. And in the red bar reflects the consensus view on climate change. In the middle bar there, you see this is the percentage of articles that were falsely balanced, and in the bottom bar, that's the percentage of articles that reflect a dismissive or skeptical view of climate change. And as you can see across the period of time, on average, in no period of time do fewer than 7 out of 10 articles reflect the consensus view on climate change. And you can see that around the time that the Copenhagen meetings were taking place on the International Agreement on Climate Change, and also the ClimateGate event broke, this is where you see a higher proportion of falsely balanced articles appearing. But as I talk about in the report, most of that false balance appears at the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal. At the Washington Post and the New York Times, on average, 9 out of 10 articles across the 2-year period reflect the consensus view, and at least 7 out of 10 articles at Politico across the 2-year period reflect the consensus view. So only at the opinion pages does this trend still hold up in terms of engaging in false balance. And that's reflective of News Corporation-owned media in general, such as Fox News, where you see in this conservative sector of the media, you still see a lot of dismissive and falsely balanced coverage. This is looking at trends and patterns of attention to climate change over time at these 5 news organizations between 2009 and the end of 2010. And this is consistent with the history of coverage of climate change over time, that climate change will peak in attention around a major political moment, like the Kyoto meetings in 1997. And here you can see that leading up to the Copenhagen meetings in December 2009, there was a major spike in attention, and then afterwards there was a major downturn in attention to climate change. But what's interesting is I look at the proportion of articles that focused on the ClimateGate event, the stolen emails from the East Anglia University Center on Climate Change. That was much debate in the blogosphere and the conservative media, but in the mainstream media, among these 5 news organizations, attention to ClimateGate only really occurred in December of 2009. And then subsequent attention was mainly confined to the Wall Street Journal. The other mainstream news organizations did not follow up with their coverage. So if the media presents a structural barrier to public participation on the issue, it's not necessarily content-based relative to the fundamentals of climate science. One of the structural barriers is not content, but rather attention. Even in the mainstream media, it's very difficult to sustain on a daily or weekly basis attention to climate change as a problem. And without that sustained attention, as we know across a lot of different public policy issues, it's very difficult to keep the issue on the public agenda. This problem with the lack of sustained attention is even greater at the regional or local level. In a place like Iowa and other regions of the country, where the local newspapers and news organizations no longer have the capacity, they may never have even ever had the capacity to adequately address the local relevance of climate and energy to a region like Iowa. And I'll come back to some solutions for bolstering the capacity of local media to address this issue. Another structural barrier to wider public participation is simply the problem of the economy. Social psychologists like to talk about our limited pool of worry, that faced with a number of different issues, we can only focus on a few risks or a few issues at a given amount of time. And over the last few years, as you know, the economy has been the overwhelming risk posed to the public. And this is often presented in terms of unemployment. So when we look at trends and belief and concern over climate change over time, we often talk about 2006 and 2007 as the peak years for public concern and belief in climate change. And certainly here in the line bar here is perception that the environment is a top priority, and then the light blue bar is the perception that global warming is a top priority. One of the things that has challenged scientists and many environmentalists to understand over the last few years is what accounts for the downturn in public attention and concern. In 2006 and 2007, the expectation was that we had reached a tipping point for public concern and attention to climate change, and we're only going to go up from there. But what's interesting is that what's often overlooked is 2006 and 2007 were the lowest years over the last decade for unemployment over the last decade. So unemployment in 2006 and 2007 was at 5.5%. Since 2006 and 2007, as you know, unemployment has gone up to close to 10% and remains at about 9.5%. So the economy is one of the strongest reasons why public concern has decreased over the last couple of years on climate change, apart from other reasons that I'll talk about later. One of the other political barriers to wider public participation is the intense polarization that has occurred on the issue. And polarization is a two-way street. Republicans and conservatives are deservedly blamed for their efforts to downplay the importance of climate change and to attack Democratic leaders like Al Gore, who have tried to take a leadership position on this issue. But you also have to consider also the communication strategies of Democratic leaders like Gore. If you look at Gore's communication strategy after he emerged after losing the election in 2000, when he first started talking about climate change and giving public speeches, it was in events with MoveOn.org, where he connected the issue of climate change to a wider criticism of the Bush administration relative to issues like the Iraq War. Those of you who've seen Inconvenient Truth know that Inconvenient Truth does a very effective job of communicating about the science of climate change, but it's also very much Gore's own personal story and narrative. And he's front and center, the major part of that movie. If you lack a favorable opinion of Gore, it's unlikely you would go and see that movie. So here in this graph, what I look at is in order to stand public perceptions of climate change and polarization on the issue over the last 10 years, you can't separate the issue from the two most prominent political figures, Bush and Gore. And in 2006 and 2007, when public concern with climate change was greatest, it was a unique time in our recent American history when the country had moved very much left of center. We had elected Democrats and Nancy Pelosi to Congress. And at the time when Gore was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize with IPCC scientists, his public approval ratings were an all-time high. Time magazine ran a cover story, The Last Temptation of Al Gore. Would he run for president or not? Before we turned to Barack Obama, the focus was on Gore as our next Democratic presidential candidate. At that same period of time, this was the low ebb historically for public approval for Bush. But today, in 2010, when approval was asked of both political figures most recently, both of them stood at about the same level. 45% of the public had a favorable opinion of either Bush or Gore, and in 2010 that level was essentially where Sarah Palin was at the time. So more than half the country has an unfavorable opinion of the political leader who's most widely associated with both climate science and climate policy, and you can't overlook that factor in terms of polarization on the issue and how the public might perceive and come to understand and make decisions about it. One of the other structural barriers is the major elite battle that has happened on climate change over the last 10 years. Much of this elite battle, as I talk about in the report, has taken place among traditional national environmental groups who have made climate change over the last 5 years their lead policy priority and cap and trade their lead policy outcome, and the long-standing coalition of groups, conservative think tanks, advocacy groups, and industry associations such as the American Petroleum Institute and the Chamber of Commerce, who have opposed action on climate change and downplayed the consensus view on the issue. If you look at these two groups, the long-standing narrative from environmentalists is that this has been a David versus Goliath type scenario. And they've often talked about the vast amount of resources that the other side has had as the major barrier to action. One of the things I try to do in the report is try to get a sense of where these resources might actually stand. So I looked at 45 national environmental groups and 42 industry associations and conservative groups and looked at their annual reports and IRS data from 2009. And what I find is that the environmental groups bring in about $1.7 billion a year in revenue, and as this green bar shows, spend about $1.4 billion on all program activities. The conservative think tanks and industry associations, they bring in a little more than $800 million in revenue, and as the gray bar shows, spend about $787 million in all program activities. When I looked at and tried to estimate spending on climate and energy activities, the environmental groups, given more resources, more spending, and a higher priority for the issue, they spend about $394 million on program activities specific to climate and energy, and the conservative think tanks and industry associations spend about $259 million. So this is really two Goliaths going at each other in an elite struggle over American politics, a struggle that I would argue has had many polarizing impacts in terms of public opinion, but rarely, as others have written, have the environmental groups turned to the public for direct participation. They've been critiqued by many who have studied the movement as being top-down hierarchical organizations who only until recently have really thought about investing in public participation and input in areas like the Midwest, and I would argue that's cost them politically over time, despite the vast sums of money that they've spent in trying to pass, for example, a cap-and-trade bill. One of the other things I look at the report is the major foundations who have invested in activities related to climate change and energy and the model of social change that they've pursued. Their model has been relatively simplistic and linear in terms of how they think that social change happens. For the most part, coming together in a 50-page plan in 2007 called the Design to Win Plan, they interviewed 150 experts on what to do about climate change. And what they got back reflected the experts they chose to interview. The report that they produced reflects strongly that social change happens through science and economics. The central policy priority was reaching a cap-and-trade-like agreement, and the assumption was that if you put a price on carbon, a wave would wash across the economy, as the report talked about, and that's how social change would happen, that energy technologies would be adopted. One of the assumptions was we had all the technologies we needed to address this issue as of 2007. If you look at their model of communication as how you achieve this goal in terms of massive change, moving from dirty energy to clean energy, it was really a linear, what people familiar with science communication, a deficit model where you have public and media education, voters and consumers, leading to education of decision makers that lead to new policy, then that lead to social change. So one of the things I do in the report is I look at, based on these 9 major foundations that fund program activities related to the environment, I took their public records for grants, and I categorized their grants by policy action and by communication activity. And what's interesting is that they followed their plan very closely. Their strategic plan reflected about $40 million associated with program activities or grants related to leading to a cap on emissions or credits, offsets, and transfers, and about a similar $30 million on trying to achieve an international agreement. But in their strategic plan, there was almost no mention of the human dimensions of the issue. There was almost no mention of things like public health, the need for adaptation, the need for economic growth and community development, or in terms of job creation, or the role of government, since the assumption was that we have all the technologies that we need. What is the role of government in investing in research and technology, R&D, at places like universities to create new energy technologies to confront this problem? So as I looked at the more than $360 million that they distributed in grants across more than 1,400 grants, only $9 million was associated with job creation, only $3 million with promoting economic growth, only $1.9 million with protecting public health, and only $1.2 million in terms of government role in innovation and R&D, and only $450,000 invested in justice and equity, program activities related to justice and activity, only 3 total grants in that area. When you look at what they invested in terms of communication activities, there was heavy investment in grants related to public communication and public education, especially related to policymakers. So $43 million associated with grants related to engaging policymakers and decision makers. Yet there was only, it's unclear what informed their engagement strategies, because only $1.7 million was invested in audience research or stakeholder research. And also they overlooked the important role of the media as part of the infrastructure in terms of need, relative to the social change, with only about $1.7 million invested directly in media initiatives such as documentary films or media organizations, not-for-profit media organizations that I'll talk about in a little bit. One of the other barriers to change and to investing in public participation is simply the outlook of our own community. The community of people who are concerned about climate change tends to be heavily one-sided in our own political outlook. One of the ways that I look at this in the report is I look at a representative sample of members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and I compare their ideological and their partisan outlook to 10 other major social groups. So in the bottom left-hand corner here, I took the plurality category in terms of partisanship, Democrat versus Republican, Republican on the top of the scale, Democrat on the bottom of the scale. Then I put them also then on this grid versus percentage liberal versus percentage conservative. And on the whole, AAAS members compared to 9 other social groups tends to be way down here in the left-hand quadrant in terms of percentage liberal and percentage Democrat. Here you have Daily Show viewers, New York Times readers, MSNBC viewers, CNN viewers, Black church members. Way up here, these are often the groups that AAAS as a political community of scientists and people working in science policy fields who devote a lot of activities to climate change communication. Way up here are the groups that we're often trying to engage. We have evangelical church members, Wall Street Journal readers, Fox News viewers, Tea Party members, Mormon church members. And here's the general public. Given the diversity of the general public, what's interesting is about 35% self-identify as conservative, and about 35% self-identify as Democrat, and about 34% independent, which is not shown there. So one of the things that we have to understand in trying to engage and try to facilitate public participation as a community of people concerned about the issue and also working at universities and science organizations and elsewhere, we often view the world politically very differently from the people that we're trying to engage. Our political views also color how we make sense of the complexity of climate change politics. Why is it that we tend to attribute inaction almost exclusively to things like false balance in the media or the presumed vast spending advantages of our opponents, or the work of Fox News and conservatives, and overlook things such as the role of the economy or the polarizing qualities of admired political leaders like Al Gore? In part, it's because we live and we work within a fairly one-sided community of people when it comes to political views. And this is something that needs to be addressed as we're trying to train scientists and we're trying to invest in public participation activities. Okay, so those are some of the structural and political barriers to action in terms of getting people to turn out to public participation opportunities and events and communicating why climate change or energy might be relevant to them. One of the key factors is how is the issue presented? How is the issue framed? Some of you are probably familiar with the research on framing or have heard at least something about it. The research in the social sciences on framing goes back several decades, and in part by work by Kahneman and Tversky, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics for the research on decision-making under uncertainty. And in their experiments, one of their key conclusions is that perception is reference-dependent, context-dependent. If I presented to you an ambiguous stimulus like this on the screen, you may not know what to make of it. It might appear as various things to those of you in the audience. But if I set the context for perception for that ambiguous stimulus as two letters, an A and a C, what once looked unclear to you is now very clear to you as a B, as a letter. If I change the context for perception for that figure from two letters to two numbers, a 12 and a 14, what once looked to you like a B is now very clearly a 13. You can think about climate change, or you can think about the problem of energy insecurity as the ultimate ambiguous stimulus for the public. Just like for scientists or those of us working on the issue of climate change politics is incredibly complex and ambiguous. For the public, climate science, its impacts and what should be done is just as ambiguous and just as complex. In order to make sense of that complexity, we readily look for reference points. We grab a hold of context, frames of reference. It could be our personal experience. It could be something that someone tells us, a trusted information source. But often it's the context that's set for us, the frame that's set for us through our preferred sources in the media or trusted opinion leaders on either side of the issue, from Al Gore to George W. Bush. The dominant frame on climate change from the environmental community, many scientists, and also as featured in Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, is what I call a Pandora's box frame. This idea that climate change is a looming environmental catastrophe. If you recall Inconvenient Truth, when the trailer came out to the Inconvenient Truth, you can just Google this on YouTube, and find it. I show it to my students often. The trailer talked about Inconvenient Truth as being the scariest movie you'll ever see. And the trailer featured heavily things like hurricane impacts, visuals of familiar cities submerged underwater, the threat to the polar bear as a symbolic species, and the poster for Inconvenient Truth was a smokestack with a plume as a hurricane coming out of it. When the movie was released, the media echoed this frame of reference. Time magazine now, as many people have pointed to, led with a tagline. This is a great example of a frame device immediately translating this catastrophe message: be worried, be very worried. And again, the symbol of the issue is the threat to an animal species, the polar bear. But imagine, for example, that so many members of the public and many of those that are already concerned about climate change, for this frame of reference, it's inherently motivating. It took people already concerned about the issue or might identify with Al Gore or in terms of liberal or democratic identity and intensified their commitment to the issue. But for many members of the public who didn't have strong environmental values, were concerned about other issues, or might not identify as a Democrat or have an unfavorable opinion of Gore, this message was probably not motivating. In fact, it might actually have turned them off to the issue. But consider, for example, if you want to widen personal relevance on the issue, if you shift the frame of reference from catastrophic environmental impacts and start to focus on health impacts, especially chronic health problems that people experience in everyday life and are already familiar with. Things like childhood asthma, allergies, vulnerability to extreme heat. What you start to do is not only you connecting climate change to a tangible thing that people experience on a chronic basis, but you're shifting the geographic location of the impacts from remote polar regions or somewhere out there in the environment to localized setting, to suburbs, to cities, and in some cases to rural places. And you're shifting the face of the impacts from animal species to human species, and also particularly to minority segments of the public who are among the most vulnerable to these health impacts. But you have to be very careful in doing this. This is one of the challenges in communicating about this, because as Discover magazine did several months ago, when they started to write a very good feature article about the health risks of climate change, in order to dramatize their cover story, they talked about the coming plague. And the image was a mosquito. So what we know from research in health communication around fear appeals, just like Inconvenient Truth used a fear appeal to try to motivate us, in this case, Discover magazine was using a fear appeal around the health impacts. What we know when people are confronted with a fear appeal and they're not giving anything they can do about that fear appeal, they tend to either reject it or it translates into fatalism. They say, well, you know, I have a high risk of cancer, but there's nothing I can do about it, so I'm not going to change my habits. Or I know there's health impacts for climate change related infectious disease, but oh well, there's not much we can do about it as a community. So getting that balance right is very important. So in my research with Ed Maybach, who's a professor at George Mason University, we've been using audience segmentation techniques from public health studies in the past on issues like obesity, and Ed and his collaborator Tony Lacerowitz have pioneered this methodology through what they call their Global Warming 6 Americas surveys. What they do in these surveys, in these nationally represented surveys, is they ask people about 40 questions related to their climate change attitudes, beliefs, behavior, and areas of knowledge. And based on their answers to those questions, they statistically segment those that represented sample into 6 distinct audience categories, ranging from the very alarmed on the issue to the very dismissive. And this shows the results of this categorization across represented samples from 2008 through June 2010. What's interesting about this distribution is that when we talk about public communication, when we talk about who's participating, when we talk about motivation and who we should try to engage with in terms of communication, we tend to focus on the tail ends of perspectives on this issue. It's either communicating to people who are already alarmed about the problem, like in Inconvenient Truth, which reached people already concerned about the issue, or trying to convince those people who are strongly dismissive, strongly skeptical. How do we convince deniers to accept the science of climate change? We also tend to way overestimate the proportion of the public who are strongly dismissive of the issue. What this audience segmentation shows is that, in fact, in between these two poles, you have roughly about 75% of the public who are relatively ambivalent about the issue. They've heard different things. They might be concerned about the issue, but it's not top of mind. They're not participating on it. Or they might be relatively disengaged. They've never even thought about the issue before being called up on the phone. In fact, this segment, the disengaged, this segment is predominantly low-income, low-educated minority segments of the public who also happen to be the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. In fact, this might be the public that's most important in terms of facilitating public participation and engagement to prepare them to cope with many of the health impacts related to climate change. So from a communication strategy, what's really of interest is, in terms of widening the net in terms of public participation, is to try to understand how to communicate about climate change in a way that makes the issue personally relevant and provides resources and opportunities for these segments of the public to get involved. For those that are already alarmed, you don't have to do a lot of convincing. In fact, their opinion intensity is already there. For them, you have to actually manage their participation so they don't engage in communication strategies that might be polarizing, or that you give them resources so they can become involved because they're actually looking for ways to do so. So in our research, what we've been looking for is what are ways to communicate about climate change that translates its personal connections to those people in the middle. We started with a study back in 2009 where we went to the National Mall in Washington, D.C. And as people walked by, they were asked to answer if they would participate in a 15-item questionnaire about climate change. And based on their answers to those 15 items, their answers were entered into a computer and they were reliably and validly placed into one of those 6 audience segments that I showed you. if these individuals that were walking by were within one of the audience segments we were still looking for, they were asked to come around the corner to the sculpture garden at the Hirshhorn Museum and sit in the shade, and they're paid $50 to be interviewed in an open-ended way for an hour about their attitudes, beliefs, and policy preferences on climate change. And at the end of that interview, then they were presented a one-page essay, where in that one-page essay, their perception about climate change was reset around the context for health. So in the opening to this essay, it talks about climate change as a threat to public health and the specific risks to public health from climate change. And at the end of the essays, we'll talk about our community-level actions that not only are mitigation actions, but have benefits, co-benefits to public health. And as they read across the essay, they were asked to mark anything in the essay in green that they found especially useful or compelling, and anything in red that they found especially confusing. And at the end of the essay, they were also asked to provide open-ended comments about what they thought. They're open-ended comments that we then coded as either positive, negative, or neutral. And what you see is that among those audience segments who are already alarmed or concerned about the issue, they had a strongly positive reaction. But even the middle segments, who are relatively disengaged, on average, they're at least neutral or in the positive direction. But what's interesting is even when presenting climate change as a health problem, those that were dismissive of the issue immediately started counter-arguing against the information in terms of the statements that they provided. Again, evidence that any attempt to try to communicate with this segment is probably wasted resources, especially given that they're only about 10 to 15% of the segment. What we also then did is we took the average number of times that each sentence was marked in green and subtracted from them the average number of times it was marked in red. And then for each sentence, then we were able to plot how they evaluated these sentences across the essay. And for those that are in the alarmed, cautious, and concerned category, their reactions are generally positive across the essay, but they go even more up in the section of the essay. They're talking about specific actions that lead to public health benefits. But more interesting is that among the disengaged, the dismissive, and the doubtful, you can see that the dismissive and the doubtful have relatively negative reactions to the risks that are posed about climate change related to health. But when specific actions are paired with their benefits to public health, the reactions go way up to those types of proposals. And I'll talk in a second what those proposals were. So overall, at the opening of the essay, when the frame was set around public health as being a value, all 6 audience segments across the scale agreed with that statement. And then all 6 audience segments agreed with the following mitigation-related actions that have public health co-benefits, had a positive reaction. So cleaner energy sources and more efficient energy use lead to healthier air to breathe. All 6 audience segments agreed with that statement. Improving the design of our cities and towns for walking, biking, and mass transit will reduce cars and help people be more active and lose weight. All 6 audience segments had a positive reaction to that proposal. Taking actions to limit global warming by making our energy sources cleaner, our cars and appliances more efficient, by making our cities and towns friendly to trains, buses, bikers, and walkers, and by improving the quality and safety of our food will improve the health of almost every American. All 6 audience segments could have reacted positively to that statement, that mitigation-related actions paired with public health benefits. But of relevance to Iowa, all 6 America's segments reacted very negatively to any proposed changes in their diet and food choices, so especially to the idea of increasing our consumptions of fruits and vegetables and decreasing our intake of meat, especially beef, will help people keep a healthy weight, will help prevent heart disease and cancer, will play an important role in limiting global warming. All 6 audience segments, whether you're alarmed about climate change or dismissive, reacted negatively to that statement. And what's interesting, we published this study in a journal called BMC Public Health, which is a peer-reviewed open source journal, so anyone can read it without a subscription. And a public health professional in California emailed us saying, this is a really interesting article, but I was thinking about it. All of these suggestions are community-level changes. These are collective changes. Your one suggestion that's at the individual level, that people should increase their consumption of fruit and vegetables and decrease their consumption of meat. Not only are you talking about meat, but you're also doing an individual level suggestion. We thought, aha, of course, right? This is something we tell our students, and the reviewers didn't catch it, but she's right. So this suggests to me that in thinking about talking about climate change and dietary choices, this is an action that we should leave as a secondary suggestion and recommendation, even though it gets a lot of attention, especially from countries like the UK and other advocates have suggested it. It's something that from a public engagement strategy we probably shouldn't be leading with, and we should be talking about other health impacts and other health recommendations. So if you go online, what we did with most recently with our research is we put together a primer for public health professionals on how to convey the human implications of climate change. From a public engagement strategy, one of the first challenges is to think about what are the other opinion leaders in society that can communicate the relevance, trusted opinion leaders that can communicate the relevance of climate change beyond environmental scientists, environmental groups, or science organizations. One of those opinion leaders are public health agencies and public health professionals. Except public health agencies and professionals, they know that climate change is a health risk, but they actually don't know much about it. And they don't know what the strategies might be for engaging the public. So part of the public engagement strategy is develop resources for this segment of professionals so they can engage their local communities on the health risks of climate change. Now what's interesting is we've also been looking at how this same segmentation of the public views the issue of energy insecurity, particularly the issue of peak petroleum. So in a paper that we have coming out at the American Journal of Public Health, we asked for the first time, we try to look at latent attitudes and perceptions about peak petroleum. You can't ask the public about peak petroleum because they've never heard of it. So we asked them generally if oil prices were to triple over the next 5 years, how harmful or helpful to the health of Americans would it be? And here I've plotted the percentage of respondents answering very harmful to health. And what's interesting is across this audience segmentation, those that are dismissive about climate change have the highest levels of risk perceptions about the health impacts related to peak petroleum and increasing gas prices. Those dismissive about climate change are also the most fearful, or are those that are most likely to anticipate that gas prices will triple over the next 3 years, and also those that are most likely to anticipate harmful economic impacts. So if you want to engage the dismissive segment of the public, instead of trying to engage them on climate change and try to change their views on climate change, energy insecurity is probably an area that you can work with conservatives and those strongly dismissive of climate change around community level and state level reactions, especially in adapting to higher energy prices and what to do about it. Okay, so what I've talked about are some of the structural, political, and motivational barriers to greater public participation on climate change. And I've talked about one of the solutions to those motivational barriers is to think about the context we set for perception around the issue. Is climate change an environmental problem or is it a health problem? Other frames of reference might be talking about climate change as a national security problem, or even shifting the frame of reference from climate change to energy security as the issue that might motivate public participation and that you're trying to build collaborations and coalitions around. But one of the other things that I've written about and I've tried to promote across different talks at different universities is to think about truly interdisciplinary, what myself and several colleagues call four-culture collaborations in thinking about public engagement. Historically, and even today, we have really a lot of intersections among the social sciences and the environmental sciences in thinking about public engagement and also solutions to the problem of climate change. But if we're really going to think about investing in public engagement, we have to bring in other disciplines that offer many things to the environmental science and social science. Those disciplines include ethics, philosophy, and religion that provide the moral and the ethical frameworks and the meaning to why climate change might matter and what to do about it. And then the creative arts and the professions. These are the storytellers in society. These are the people that take the data from science and the meaning from philosophy and religion and put it together into compelling narrative and a story. But how do you actually facilitate these types of cross-disciplinary interactions? Where does the money, where does the incentives come from? And one of the things that we recommend at a university like Iowa is either at the college level or the university level that you take the broader impacts money from grants related to the sciences and you pool that broader impacts money at the college or the university level and you use that money to invest it around a few public engagement initiatives where you have these types of four-culture collaborations. You have people from these disciplines thinking about how to invest this money, and that also becomes a site for research, what makes for effective public engagement and what kind of impact they might be. And it also makes future science grants that much more competitive because you have a model for how to actually facilitate broader impacts. Some of these public engagement initiatives, some of you are very familiar with, but public meetings, well-organized public meetings, deliberative forums, there's been a lot of research, there's been a lot of efforts around these, especially in Europe, but more recently in the United States, But well-designed public forums have a lot of benefits that I talked about in the beginning. When you bring people together around a public forum, especially you thinking about the role of framing in a public forum. Is this a public forum about the health implications of climate change? Is it about the moral and religious implications of climate change? Is it about the national security implications? Each one of those different frames of reference will appeal to a different stakeholder group, and you can facilitate discussion through that frame of reference. What we know from research is that participating in these types of public forums leads to enhanced learning, leads to enhanced levels of trust, and people after turning out to these events are more likely to become participatory on the issue than before turning out to one of these events. Now, the problem is, as I talked about earlier, thinking about the media as an important part of the communication infrastructure that we need for communities to come together around solutions on climate and energy. And one suggestion that I've been talking to a lot of different people about, and this is a model that has been pioneered in places, different universities across the country in terms of thinking about investigative journalism units. But Climate Central is a unit that's based in Princeton, New Jersey, an affiliate of Princeton University that's an example of this, is universities becoming news providers. What this would mean would be a university like Iowa State with other universities like the University of Iowa and other universities in Iowa would use their professional and faculty expertise along with their students through foundation and government grant support to also hire a professional news editor, it might be an out-of-work journalist, with a freelance budget. And this digital news community would cover climate and energy issues for the state of Iowa. So you have professionally produced, independently produced news. You would also have video storytelling there. But you would also use the best technologies and the best know-how from social media to facilitate a discussion at the social media site as part of these digital news communities. So here's an example. I'm familiar with upstate New York because I grew up there, and I gave a talk to Cornell University pitching this idea a few weeks ago. But if you took a partnership amongst Syracuse University, Columbia University, SUNY Stony Brook, and University of Buffalo, some of these have journalism programs, some do not, some have expertise in the sciences. You had a full-time editor and 2 staff writers, a full-time online community organizer who helped construct the site and manage it. You can, through the parts of in terms of content, you can facilitate things like alumni magazine articles, news stories from the Research News Office, but importantly, you can also bring to the university place-based bloggers from the cities across the state, bloggers who are writing about community development, they're writing about health, they're writing about energy and climate change, they're writing about sustainability. You can educate them about the issues here, but you can also train them to be effective and ethical bloggers. And what you would then do is you would take their RSS feeds and you would feed them into the digital news community, so that would be part of the content there. You'd be expanding the scope of their audience, but you would also be facilitating citizen voices as part of this digital news community. And every time you have a public meeting or a public forum, that public meeting or public forum would be covered by the digital news community. You can even produce short documentaries about what happened at that forum. So in this case, the news content would also be shared with the news organizations across the state. So it would be free syndication. Public media organizations, newspapers who want to cover climate and energy, the not-for-profit media that's produced through this site would also be shared at those sites. And what's interesting, I'm sure this is very similar in Iowa and upstate New York, the Buffalo News, the Syracuse Post-Standard, the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, they have among the highest penetration rates for local newspapers in the country. 90% of the people living in those cities, if they read a newspaper, read those newspapers rather than something else like the USA Today, the New York Times. So in smaller communities, smaller cities, in places like upstate New York and Iowa, you have high levels of social capital, a digital news community can have that much more of an impact in terms of facilitating public participation and learning. The other thing that you coordinate with these public meetings and also the digital news communities is an opinion leader campaign and strategy. The research in the social sciences on opinion leaders goes back several decades. These are people that are more interested in a particular issue or more interested and more knowledgeable about public affairs. Not only they follow the issue more closely, they have a level of opinion strength where they're very good at taking information and passing it on to others. In today's social media world, the role of opinion leaders is amplified through Twitter, through blogs, and importantly now through handheld devices. So based on the research on opinion leadership through surveys and other strategies, you can easily identify everyday opinion leaders, people either on public affairs or on climate and energy generally, or for example in agriculture, who can be recruited and trained, and every time you want to engage the wider public on an issue through public meetings, digital news communities, you can send out emails and you can trigger your opinion leader network to go out and talk up the issue to others and pass on information. And imagine if each one of your opinion leaders could download an iPhone app where they're talking to someone else about, say, the impacts of climate change in agriculture. They don't know the answer to the question, so they just pull up their iPhone app and they have a little FAQ there. Or they could flip around their iPhone and show that person a short video about the climate impacts and what can be done in terms of agriculture. Training and recruiting opinion leaders and matching it up to things like public forums in a digital news community is perhaps the best way to create the type of communication infrastructure that you need to widen the net in terms of public participation on climate change and energy insecurity. And then finally, one of the things that I'm waiting to hear back on for a grant is you can do a lot of things with the communication infrastructure and investing in public engagement after people are done with their formal education. But if you really want to increase public participation on issues related to science, technology, and the environment, you also have to rethink science education. So how many people have heard of STEM education, of the acronym STEM education? Okay, all of you working here at a science university. But what's interesting, the New York Times ran an article last year called STEM Education Has Little to Do with Flowers. And Eric Lander, who was co-chair of the PCAST committee that looked at science education, said, everybody who knows what it means, and everyone else doesn't, referring to the acronym STEM. I would argue that even at universities within the STEM community, not everyone agrees what STEM education means, what should be the goals, and how to go about it effectively. So what I've proposed, along with others, is that it's time to understand the audience, the decision makers for STEM education. Just like we study the public in terms of their views and attitudes about climate and energy, we need to study ourselves in terms of how do we think about the value of STEM education? Is it in terms of just workers? Or are we also thinking about STEM education in terms of citizenship and participation? Among decision makers in terms of setting policy and investing in STEM education, how do they perceive the goals from the national academies to the National Science Foundation? How do they frame the problems and the challenges and what should be done? Where do they assign responsibility? Who do they look to for opinion leaders and information sources? Importantly, how do students view the value of STEM education? What relevance or what significance is it to them? And it's through this type of audience research with specialized stakeholders and the constituents for STEM education, we can start to rethink how we prepare students to be active participants in the debates over climate and energy over time. And for STEM education generally, a big problem like climate and energy can be a major catalyst for both investment and also change. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thanks. And I leave you with a picture of one of my favorite places, which is Acadia National Park in Maine. This is Cadillac Mountain view looking down on Bar Harbor. So, yes.
I wanted to comment on the media component of your presentation, which I thought was very good. Many helpful things. You really can't compare. You can't really say that the media understands the consensus view that the New York Times and the Washington Post. You can't even do that. The variables differ so greatly between 2002, 2006, and 2010. Washington Post closed all its bureaus recently. When you talk about penetration rates, those publications that you looked at all have one thing in common. They have a science reporter, number one, and number two, they penetrate less than 1/10 of 1% of the American public. On the other hand, you were kind of alluding to that towards the end of your presentation. That nebulous middle is served by the Harlem Tribune, which has a 95% penetration
I agree with you. So in this report, which, given limited resources and time, I chose the national trend-setting newspapers that have been looked at past studies, but also remain the debate among elites, the idea that the New York Times is not getting the story right. And so I chose those papers to try to say, okay, for the trend-setting influential papers, while cap and trade was being debated, while Copenhagen was happening, how were they conveying the views about climate science? And
the battle with the opinion leaders is
yeah,
won.
right. Yeah. No. So even in measuring how they define climate science, it's difficult because just like in looking at political bias, you have to start with a relatively narrow objective definition. And so in the Boykoff studies, what he looked at was simply how do they portray the reality of climate change and is it human cause, the fundamentals of climate science, and that's how it was measured there. And then getting reliable and valid measurement of other areas where the error bars are more uncertain, there's more scientific disagreement, like the connection between climate change and hurricanes, or politically whether cap and trade should be done, that's more difficult to measure. But what I have done is, and I'm writing this up this summer, is I've done the same thing with the major regional papers in Michigan, West Virginia, and South Carolina in 2009, 2010. Those are politically important states for the congressional districts, and the same types of questions you were asking I want to look at. So example, how much of the coverage is international, AP, national, how much of it is local? And I also agree with you that one of the major biases in the media, even at the national media, is not the content in terms of the portrayal of climate science, but attention. Attention spiking around political events, and then almost no real significant tension for weeks, months after that. And I think that attention bias is even greater at the local community level because they don't have the capacity to cover it. And that's why I was suggesting that a digital news community in a state like Iowa that could also syndicate and share really good coverage with the Des Moines Register, with public media organizations, which are becoming digital media hubs. And so if you and Michael do want to do that study, I'd love to give you my coding frame, and then we can compare the results across.
I don't think that's been done before. We'll
Yeah.
have to take a look at the literature
Yeah.
review, but I would bet that has not been done.
Yeah,
before.
no, yeah.
Also,
Not at the local papers, yeah.
Your local gatherings, I thought that was brilliant because that would generate the local stories.
Yep.
in the heart
Yeah,
of the
exactly.
Tribune. I mean,
Exactly.
That's what's really
Exactly, yep. Yes.
Alan Kozlov from Skeptics
Yeah.
Government Podcast. Really great talk. I appreciate it. But I got it raised more questions actually than it answered, as any good academic talk usually does. One of the things was when you talked about your 5 news agencies that you looked at, they were all print. And and the question is what percentage of the public get their information from print versus from electronic media? Then the slide that you had, the correlation between Bush and Gore's popularity.
Yeah.
If you actually, the question is, and also between unemployment and the environment. The question is correlation versus causation. If on that one with Gore, if you plotted his weight during that same period, it would be the exact opposite of his popularity. And so, does his weight have anything to do with it? Then another question that I have is the 2 end groups of the 6 groups.
Yeah.
They are probably driving the letters to the editor and the people who text in to CNN or to Fox more than the other ones.
Yep.
But I also know from the data that the vaccine deniers almost match up exactly with that. And the other science deniers and also the popularity of the Tea Party also match up with that.
So I'll stop you because there's a lot of questions there, but so that's okay. Those are all good questions. For the news organizations, most of those news organizations, what appears in the newspaper remains the central content of their online news site. So what I talk about in the report, for example, is obviously there's blogs and there's additional content there. But for the New York Times, the Washington Post, their lead stories are the stories that are appearing that day also in print. And those news organizations are among the top 5 most read news organizations online. I think New York Times is number 3 or 4, but Washington Post is like 7 or 8. CNN.com is not a print. It's an online news source. CNN.com has become like the Associated Press, so they do their own online news stories that are syndicated to other news organizations, and it's the 4th most widely read news source online. And what's interesting is, people are moving towards online sources for their news, And that's especially the case now among under 30s for the first time, that a majority of people get their news online versus through other sources. But these papers still set the trend and the tone for coverage at other outlets, including broadcast across the country, both the agenda and also the tone. So again, looking at other online sources is important, but you only had resources to look at 5. The thing about so your second question was the cause correlation, right? So what I didn't talk about looking at the economic trend data, and I talk about in the report, is that it looks like with the trend data, there's the most parsimonious explanation for why there's been a downturn on climate change is the performance of the economy. And there's a really interesting study by 2 economists who took national survey data. First of all, they looked at Google search trends at the state level. And there's very strong variation by unemployment level at the state level in seeking out information about climate change versus jobs. So as unemployment goes up in a state, searching for climate change goes down, search terms related to climate change goes down, and search terms for jobs go up. All right, so that plays on people's motivation and the perceived risks. The other thing they looked at is in national level data is the relationship at the state level between unemployment and perceptions of 5 indicators on climate change: concern, belief, perceived priority. I forget what the other indicators are. Controlling for demographics and other factors, a very strong relationship between unemployment level in the state and a respondent's belief and concern about climate change. And then they went to California with state-level data in California, where California generally has a high level of environmental values compared to other states. And at the county level, unemployment, controlling for other factors, is strongly related to the perceived priority of the environment versus the perceived priority of jobs. So between the trend data in that study by economists and what we know about from social psychology research in terms of our limited pool of worry, it all suggests that the economy shouldn't and can't be overlooked as a major factor accounting for public opinion trends, maybe the most likely factor. With the opinion trends on Bush versus Gore, what's interesting is that in the social science studies that we have about 40 studies that have looked at the role of the conservative movement, Republicans, in shaping public opinion about climate change. But there's only one study from 2002 when I was in graduate school that looks at the role of Democratic leaders in shaping public opinion about climate change. And what that study shows is that in 1997, when the Clinton White House tried to have a campaign in support of Kyoto, the researchers did a national survey before the campaign and then afterwards. And what they found was that the Kyoto campaign on behalf of that the Clinton White House didn't have an impact in the aggregate on overall public opinion. But for the first time during that period, you see a difference between how strong partisans, Republicans and Democrats, viewed the issue. Democrats grew more concerned and were more supportive of international action. Republicans grew less concerned and were less supportive. And then if you follow the trend lines over time, what essentially happened over the last decade is Republicans really didn't change in their views about climate change. They remained at about 45% in several different indicators in terms of belief, concern, and some other indicators. It's Democrats who were mobilized in their belief. They went from about 50% concerned early in the decade to 75% by 2007. And that's completely consistent with political communication research on elite cues, how individuals not wanting to collect a lot of information on a policy issue simply look at what the messages that they're receiving from trusted political leaders. And if you look at the messages from trusted political leaders at that time, you had Gore saying this was an urgent problem. Republicans were the major barrier to action. You have Republicans saying, no, this is not a major problem. This is just Al Gore trying to fool you. There's a lot of interesting things that went on in 2006, 2007 around the kind of celebrity culture around Gore. The Academy Awards, the MTV Music Awards, his appearance on something like more than a dozen magazine covers. And it all fits also with things that were going on in political culture more generally when the country at that time was more left of center. So all those things suggest that we should look more carefully at the role that Democratic leaders have played, especially Gore, in shaping polarization on the issue. Polarization is not a one-way street. We know that from a lot of studies in political communication. So, yep.
Something that I think that you haven't been looking at is the role of religion in this discussion. Not only directly on the opinion of climate change, but on the opinion of scientists in general. So you just mentioned trusted leaders, and the message of trusted leader to the general public and
Yeah, it's a couple interesting things that your question raises. One question is, why is it that members of AAAS, scientists in general, are overwhelmingly one-sided in their political outlook? Also, why is it that they're overwhelmingly one-sided in their religious outlook, too, in terms of being more secular, less religious? And there's a couple different political scientists have looked at the professors in general. AAAS members match up pretty well with surveys of professors in general in terms of their political outlook. And one reason they provide is that this is a self-selection process, part of socialization. When students are in college, those that select themselves into pursuing a PhD, that Republican students opt out of pursuing a PhD because they turn to careers that lead to business and going into other industry. Whereas students who self-select into PhD careers tend to have stronger liberal values, and there's different things associated with that. And so it's an interesting self-selection process. Same thing happens with religion, that it's not that science education as pursuing a PhD kind of burns away your religious beliefs, but there's a really good book out now by a sociologist at Rice University that finds that process actually starts when you're young, that people who grow up in more secular households are more likely to choose a career in science, where those that grow up in more religious households are less likely to do so. And so the choice, that the fact that people are already more secular happens even before they start learning about science at an advanced level when they're pursuing a PhD. The other part of your question is, if I understand it correctly, you were saying that the authority of scientists are being challenged by religious leaders, and that's undermined the ability of scientists to communicate and be effective on climate change. Okay. I think that there's a general narrative, and this has been a narrative within the science community and within popular culture for a long time, that almost every decade has a different sort of fall from grace narrative about science, that science is under attack or the authority of scientists are being undermined. And most of the public opinion research suggests otherwise, that scientists among social groups remain the most trusted and the most admired. And science as an institution, this varies by particular issues, but science as an institution, only the military has higher levels of trust. And Americans overwhelmingly believe in the promise of science to improve their lives. So the good quantitative indicators that we have show that the cultural authority of science remains as high as it ever has been. In fact, it might be, those that are critics of science would argue that the cultural authority of science is too great. But I think one of the problems is actually that science, in part, has alienated itself from religious communities. And this is through some movements like the New Atheist Movement, Richard Dawkins and others, who argue that science undermines religion, even respect for religion. And one of the most effective ways to engage the public, different segments of the public, on climate change is to talk about its moral meaning and its religious meaning. So if there's increased distrust among science and religious leaders, in part over the debate over evolution, or driven by outspoken scientists like Richard Dawkins, it undermines our ability to engage religious Americans. E.O. Wilson, I think, makes this case very provocatively and effectively when he argues that I'm an atheist, but if I sat down with a Baptist minister, on 95% of things we would agree. And can't we all come together and try to work together on those things we agree instead of always, trying to look at points of disagreement? And I think that's one of the challenges on climate change. Yes.
I had a question. In the middle of your presentation, you showed that the two ends of the spectrum, the ones that are strongly supportive and the ones that are strongly dismissive, tend to have the same reactions. And especially with the dismissive sector, they stay very dismissive of any type of information about climate change. And you said that we should focus our communication away from those people and towards the broader 75%. My challenge as a journalist is that low number of people tends to be the most vocal.
Yep.
How do I address the indecisive 75% without drawing attention to the strongly dismissive or taking on their viewpoints directly?
Right. I think part of it is having fixed. She said that as a journalist, even though this segment is relatively small, and you mentioned this, that Essentially, if you look at climate change blogs, right, who's commenting on climate change blogs? First of all, people select themselves into skeptical blogs and pro-science, pro-action blogs, right? But if you look at like Andrew Revkin's .earth New York Times blog, and if you look at the comments there, you'll see a heavy amount of comments from people who are dismissive of the issue. And just like in the real world, opinion intensity drives participation in the online world. The more intensely you feel about an issue, the more threatened you feel about an issue, the more likely you are to participate. And this is also the case with science blogging, is that the people who are blogging among scientists are probably those that are most committed to an issue. In fact, they might be the most politically ideological. One of the interesting things that I want to do is look at this. My expectation among this AAAS data is they have 3 questions there in terms of how frequently among AAAS members do you talk to the public, how frequently do you blog, and how frequently do you engage in terms of talking to journalists. My expectation is that in terms of ideological distribution, it's the people at the tail ends of the ideological distribution, the 19% who self-identify as very liberal and the 9% who self-identify as conservative, who are the most active in communication activities. Right? That's a problem, because the voice that the public is hearing from among scientists are the people at the tail ends of the distribution in terms of political identity. If that holds true, that's a hypothesis that I have. But as a journalist, one thing is to recognize that when you get an email back or you get a comment at what you write, that it's incredibly, first of all, it's a choice to read your article about an interest in the issue, and then to comment on it is even more of a choice. So the people who are leaving those comments are the people who feel most opinion intense. Either we dramatically need action now, and you're probably writing a good article when people on the 2 tail ends are both criticizing you. Chances are you've written a pretty good article in that case, right? That's something that Andrew Revkin talks about. So you need to kind of acknowledge that, but also is how do you get beyond just those 2 tail end communities? That's where framing comes in. That's if you're writing a story about the health implications instead of the environmental impacts, which are important. But once you start talking about the health implications or climate change as it connects to things like community development and economic growth, or religious values, or national security, it's those types of stories where you're likely to go beyond just the tail end of the spectrum in terms of who's paying attention and who's commenting. Yes?
Ames has a sustainability task force, a group of cross-section of the community working on reducing our use of energy, particularly electricity, and in our buildings and homes. And one of the first sessions that we had, they invited a person from Kansas who is in charge of the state sustainability coordination program. And they started a program of having 9 cities who volunteered to cooperate in reducing the energy use in those cities.
Mm-hmm.
And they publicized it widely within those cities as the reasons for this was climate change was one was to save energy and reduce the use of energy and the need for coal-burning power plant, all these environmental kinds of things and economic things. But they found that the principal motivator in those communities was competition with the neighboring town.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
They wanted to beat the neighboring
Yep.
town.
Yep.
So how do you communicate that?
Well, I didn't talk about it in this presentation, but it relates to things like opinion leaders, is social norm perceptions. So instead of giving people prescriptive information, you should do this, or if you do this, this will benefit the environment, you give people descriptive information that 80% of members of your community are taking energy efficiency efforts, right? A specific energy efficiency effort. Because people often, when faced with a complex choice, instead of gathering information about that choice, they'll simply look around to their social environment to see what the majority norm might be. And in this case, this competition among towns connects to both perceived norms but also identity, right? It becomes a matter of pride. It becomes a matter of civic pride. Connects to things like social capital. All of those things are, apart from how well that the members of that community actually understand energy or climate change. And so it's always balancing the need to educate people about these specifics, about these dimensions, to then understanding human nature and collective action, which is often not based on information but on these other things, right? Like identity and perceived social norms. So I think we have time for one more question. Or otherwise, well, thank you very much. I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards.